everyone, how are we doing today? This is James Sweeney, aka SplitSuit, and welcome back to another video. In this video, I want to talk all about limped pots. And limped pots can oftentimes be a little confusing as far as the mentality we want to take in them, and also the range that we usually get involved in limped pots usually tend to be medium to usually kind of weakish, especially if we're getting free plays out of the blinds or a nice cheap complete from the small blind, that sort of stuff. So in this video, I'm going to talk all about limped pots, the mentality I like to take. We're going to look a lot at post-flop situations in these spots and talk a little bit about pre-flop as far as should we have limped versus should we have ISO'd or not, and just kind of go forward from there. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it, start having some fun, and talk about limped pots. So let's first start by looking at a situation like this, where there are two limpers to us, we're deciding what we want to do, and in this situation I usually look at two different things. One is who are the original limpers, and two, how do I think I can make the most amount of money here. Now, I'm pretty much never going to fold this, strictly because I think that limping it behind is for sure going to be plus EV, so my only other question is, would raising be more plus EV? So in this particular situation, I would look at who the original limpers are, what do I expect them to do, are they going to limp fold a lot, are they going to limp call a lot, do I expect either of those options to be good for me, blah blah blah. And then of course, as always, I want to look behind me as well. If I raise, do I expect to get 3-bet a lot, do I expect to get another caller who calls then invites the other two to come along, that sort of stuff. And when you're thinking about isolating, I know I've talked about this in other videos, especially the isolation video, but remember, one of the most important people is the original open limper, because that person, if that person limp calls, that person is usually going to invite everybody else to call as well. So make sure you think about that. Think about whether your hand plays well in a multi-way pot where the SPR is getting slimmer, or if you should just kind of limp behind and get involved in a deeper SPR pot where you still get to play and get involved, but you don't necessarily have to raise it. So in this situation, we do decide to limp behind, get a 5-way pot, and we end up bricking pretty badly. So in these situations, as a default, when I have absolute air in a limped pot, my standard default is just going to be, okay, I want to get out of this as cheap as possible. I'm usually not going to be doing a lot of bluffing in multi-way limp pots because, well, the limp pots I'm usually involved in are going to be multi-way. And because of that, am I really going to want to bluff in situations like that? Probably not a tremendous amount of the time, at least not without decent information. So as a default, if you just kind of folded here and gave up when you bricked in these limped pots, as a default, that's usually going to be a very good strategy, keeps you out of trouble. And again, your edge doesn't really come from trying to create home runs with bluff hands in multi-way limped pots. Usually it's just kind of limp in, see if you can smash a flop. If you don't, usually getting out of it. If you do, obviously play poker from there. Okay, I actually want to look at a situation that comes up a fair chunk that tends to confuse people. So let's look at a spot like this where there's two limpers to us. We're in the small blind with a mid-range pocket pair, and it's kind of confusing as to whether or not you should raise this or just go for the complete and play poker from there. So as a default, I tend to kind of just complete this and play poker. If I knew that I could raise it and either isolate one of the two limpers, or I could raise it and generate a pretty great edge, then by all means go for it. But most of the time it's going to be very difficult because, again, if you raise here, chances are the MP1 is probably going to limp call. Once he does, cutoff's probably going to call as well. Now all of a sudden you're in a pretty bloated pot, out of position with a mid-range pair where you're going to deal with overcards a ton of the time, you're going to miss your set a tremendous amount of the time, and there's a massive amount of confusion. And also, is it really going to be that profitable in the first place? It's up for debate, but as a default, like I said, I have nothing wrong with just completing this. So I actually want to talk a moment about my small blind completion range, because I think it tends to be a little confusing for most people. So as a default, I would complete here with all pairs that I wouldn't raise with. I would complete here with any suited ace. I would complete here with topside suited connectors, and also any two Broadway cards that I don't feel comfortable raising with and that I want to play. So for instance, if I was sitting here with, say, Queen 10 off, and I didn't feel comfortable playing Queen 10 off out of position in a multi-way pot, there's nothing wrong with just folding it here. Really isn't. So that would kind of be the way that I would think about it. And as far as which Broadway cards I feel comfortable raising versus not raising, it's definitely going to be dependent on how many limpers there are, what my edge is post-flop, what I expect those limpers to do pre-flop, what I expect the big blind to do in this particular situation, blah, blah, blah. And then same mindset when I'm talking about how big of a pair I want to raise or not raise in this particular situation. So those are kind of the little things that I'm looking for when I'm considering going for my small blind complete. And notice when I was talking about that range, I didn't say I'm going to complete here with something like King 7 suited or 5-6 off. I'm not completing with hands that just perform kind of like junk. I think too many people look at this as, oh, I'm getting 7 to 1. I should just complete here with a wide range because I'm getting such a great price. But remember, in No Limit, you can get absolutely hammered for doing that. And think about the kind of boards you hit with, say, a hand like 5-6 off. Yes, you catch some straights, but oftentimes they're going to be bottom side straights, or you're catching 2-pair on boards that are kind of weird. So those aren't really the kind of hands that I would be doing a lot of completing with from the small blind, just as a default. So we do decide to complete here. And a lot of people get confused with these situations where they catch like a pair and flush draw, and it's obviously a mid-range flush draw at this point. And most of the time, I'm just going to say, don't think about this as I have a pair and flush draw. Think about it as what is my bet going to accomplish. If I bet, I'm pretty much only getting looked up by hands that either beat me or have a sick equity edge. And is that really going to be that good? Probably not. Do I really want to get into the check call game where I'm never really going to be able to play turns very well? Probably not. And because of that, there's really nothing wrong with just saying forget it, check folding, and being done. And you notice I'm maintaining that mentality of, unless I really kind of hit the board kind of strongly, especially out of position, as a default in these limped pots, I'm going to be playing a little bit tighter and a little bit more controlled post-flop especially. Alright, let's look at another spot, one where we have Jack 6, there's a limp and a complete, and we're deciding what we want to do. So as a default, I'm still looking at the same stuff. If I raise, what do I expect that raise to do? If I expect I can raise here and both of them will fold a tremendous amount of the time, awesome. If I expect that if I raise here and cutoff will fold a lot, small blind will call a lot, then I would obviously want to make sure that I have a decent hand or a really decent idea on how I can make money. Either that he calls too much pre and then folds too much post, that sort of stuff. So, as a default with something like, say, Jack 6, I'm just going to say forget it, check, and try to see a flop for cheap, go forward from there and play poker. And again, if you just kind of remain tight from the blinds without really excellent information that tells you if you can raise it or not, usually that will be a lot better and keep you out of a lot of trouble. So in this situation, we end up catching top pair, and when I catch top pair in especially three-way limped pots, chances are I'm just going to be betting it out. And the bet can get me looked up by some second best hands, things like straight draws, flush draws, 8x, that sort of stuff. So I usually will bet it strictly for value. And also because I can't really expect anyone else to do the betting for me, there's a decent chance that one of these two guys, again, can make that calling mistake, so I go for the bet. Now, something that you want to think about here and that gets said a lot as your limped pot mantra is the mantra of never go broke in a limped pot. And I really do kind of agree with that. As a default, I want to be very careful about if I'm ever stacking off in a limped pot because the SPR is just so deep. Is it really going to be that good for you to get your stack involved? So as a default, I'm going to suggest you be kind of following that mantra of just being very cautious about the size of the pot you're creating in these limped pots. As a default, it's usually going to be a small to possibly mid-size pot at best. So kind of keep that in mind. It's going to be difficult to generate a lot of value, and if your opponents really start getting active, really ask yourself, is this the kind of pot size I want to get involved in, especially because your hand strength is usually going to be a little janky coming from a free play. So in this particular spot, the small blind calls, 3 on the turn, and at this point, you're just playing poker. Same thing as you're playing poker on the flop as well, but you're just playing poker here. If you think that the small blind is never going to make a calling mistake, well, think about that. If you think that the small blind is very likely to continue calling with things like 8x and flush draws and all that sort of stuff, yeah, maybe you just go for the value bet and then obviously play rivers as best as possible. On that particular river, unless you really think you can get looked up by an 8x and that a lot of his range is 8x, I would just kind of check behind, take a note on whatever he has, and go forward from there. So pretty easy situation. Again, you notice that final pot size, pretty small to medium sized, and that's usually a pretty good aim point in these limped pots post flop. Again, not exploding pots just because I have top pair, but again, still playing poker, thinking about what your bets accomplish, and just going forward from there. Okay, let's look at another spot where there's a couple limpers, and we're sitting here with 9-8 suited. And as I've said before, as a default, I want to get involved here with a topside suited connector. So I'm just in a situation of deciding whether or not I want to raise or limp. If I think that I can raise, I have enough information that I know that it's going to be profitable and more profitable than limping, then I'll go for it. If I don't, and again, as a default, I would just limp this behind and play poker from there. So I ended up going 4-way to it, catch a 2-way straight draw, and have this worth 3 checks to us. So at this point, I will normally just kind of go for a bet with a 2-way straight draw or better in a multi-way pot. So in this particular situation, and I'm just strictly talking about draws at this point. So obviously the more limpers there are, maybe the less likely I am to make this bet, but as a default I like it, and from a pure bluff standpoint, it definitely does do what a bluff needs to do. I can name at least 3 better hands that would fold, things like some ace highs, some king highs, some queen highs. So in this particular situation, I definitely accomplish what I need to, and if someone calls, obviously I'm just going to play poker better than they do post-flop. It's pretty much that simple. And also in this particular situation, say someone had bet into us, chances are I'm just going to call, play poker on the turn and riv, make some math decisions if I face another bet. You know, I will occasionally go for a semi-bluff raise or something, but I really want information before I start doing that, and as a default, I would probably just call the first bet and again play poker on the turn and riv. But in this spot where there's just checks to us, I'm just going to go for the bet and just go forward from there. So MP2 decides to call, queen on the turn, he checks, and at this point, again, we're just playing poker. So at this point we have a semi-bluff, and we ask ourselves, okay, what do we want to do with a semi-bluff? Well, our general thought process with a semi-bluff is bet if we can generate enough folds. So if you thought that you could generate enough folds, then by all means go for the double barrel. If you didn't think you could generate folds, or enough folds, sorry, then I would just say forget it, check behind, and try to actualize my equity. It's legit that level of simple. So don't make it too complex and make it too unnecessarily difficult. Just simply ask yourself, what's your hand strength? What's your general thought process with that hand strength? Who's your opponent? What's he going to logically do if he faces a bet? And make a decision from there. If you're ever confused, keep the pot size smaller. It's legit that easy. So that's exactly the kind of thought process I would use here. So on the riv, we end up catching a 6. He bets. And at this point, your raise size should just be as big as he would make the mistake to. Now, in order for him to bet here, he should be pretty strong, probably 2 pair or better a fair chunk of the time, because it's probably pretty unlikely that he would bet here with a 10. But anything that he's going to call with, the 2 pair plus range, or maybe he has some weird queen X, maybe he has some weird queen jack, I don't know. But anything he's going to call a raise with, he'll probably be relatively inelastic, so I'll usually size up a little bit larger in this particular spot. If you thought you could go 34, by all means go 34. If you thought you can go 38, same mindset. So usually in this situation, if you're going to get a call, it's usually going to be by something kind of topside weighted, and oftentimes it's going to be relatively inelastic in my opinion, which is why I go for the slightly larger size. And I definitely want to make sure I take a note. I want to take a note that he obviously limped that behind preflop as opposed to ISO it. I want to take a note that he check called the flop with second pair like that, and also take a note that he bet called that particular riv with 2 pair, and that he is probably pretty inelastic with 2 pair or better a fair chunk of the time. So again, pretty decent hands. It should all make sense as far as the preflop and also the post-flop actions. And again, if you kind of play these pots well, if you size well, if you really think about what your hand strength is and how you want to create a line based upon that hand strength, post-flop should be very, very easy in these limped pots. Alright, let's look at another spot, one where there's a couple limps to us, we're deciding what we want to do. Again, as a default with these suited aces and these very deep pots like this, I usually am just going to limp these behind, and if you don't feel comfortable with post-flop, if you can't play flush draws well, if you don't feel comfortable playing top pair no kicker, or you don't feel comfortable playing like top and bottom pair, then usually I would just suggest folding this. That's no problem. Obviously, I would suggest you get yourself to a point where you can feel very, very comfortable limping this. But if you're not there yet and you don't think you can play this profitably enough, then by all means, there's nothing wrong with just folding this pre. Now, I'll also say this, make sure that, again, you're checking stack sizes. If everyone involved here has 30 big blinds, that's not really going to be something I want to limp behind with. If the button is a mega isolator and he's going to like raise this to 8 every single time, probably not going to limp this. So definitely make sure, again, you're still looking at all the different variables pre-flop that will either give more or less validity to your limp. So we do decide to limp, end up going very, very multi-way, and end up snapping the nut flush, which is always nice. So at this point, we get a bet and a couple callers. So I'm going to say two things real quick. Let's say that instead of having the nuts here, we just had a nut flush draw. So instead of that 6 of spades, it was the 6 of hearts instead. Well, my normal mindset there is I have a nut flush draw. I really don't see a tremendous amount of reason to raise without some massive info. And I would just kind of take my 4.5 roughly to 1, and just go to the turn, try to catch my flush, and go from there. So now we're talking about, again, how we just play the flush draw. When we catch the nuts like this, usually I'm kind of in a raise mode because I have a value hand. It will be pretty difficult to get stacks inside if I just called this 450 bet, strictly because, again, it's a limped pot. It's such a mega deep SPR. It's really difficult to get stacks inside. So if you really want to get stacks inside, you kind of have to start raising right off the bat. Yes, it starts turning your hand face up, but what you're doing is you're pretty much saying, okay, I'm just going to get action when I'm kind of on the good side of a cooler, or when I find someone who just is unable to fold something like Jack 9 or pocket 6s or something like that. So if you think that it's enough of that, or you think someone's like a fish, like say the small blind would bet call here with King Jack with the King of Spade or something like that, it's really just a raise strictly for value, and also just from a pot geometry standpoint, trying to ensure that you can get stacks inside by the riv. So you end up getting called by under the gun, and as far as bet sizing is concerned, just bet as much as you think you can. If you thought that you could shove the turn profitably, fine. As a default, I'm probably just going to be betting something closer to 2/3, and then of course going for the rest on the riv, assuming that it doesn't board pair. So pretty easy, and again, as a default, I had a value hand on the flop, so my value mindset is I want to get a big pot going. I think second best hands will continue enough of the time, and thus I'm going to go for a raise. And again, the raise is good from a pure value standpoint, but also from a pot geometry standpoint, ensuring that I allow myself to get stacks inside. And also remember, there's a bunch of turn cards that could have been pretty bad. Thinking about another spade that could have come off that maybe slows up a second best hand, or so many bad things or even like a king pops off and all of a sudden Jack X gets quiet. So as a default, I'm just going to be raising, trying to get my stack inside, and going forward from there. Again, very, very profitable, and makes sense because, as I said, we have a value hand. Okay, let's look at this spot where there is a limp. And in this particular situation, for whatever reason, we think that it's going to be better to limp this behind as opposed to isolate. And oftentimes that's kind of the thought process I'll take a lot, especially with these baby pairs. Limping behind, I can create a multi-way pot where people start limping in with suited connectors and stuff that they can make mistakes with. So, and again, it's really depending on who under the gun is. If under the gun is a pretty big fish, chances are I'm just going to limp this back and try to create a multi-way pot as opposed to ISO and attack, where the attack usually isn't going to work very well. So in this spot, we do end up bricking, and so I'm going to take two different situations here. Let's take this board where we caught air. So I have a nothing hand, and because I have a nothing hand, I ask myself, can I bluff? Will my bet generate enough folds here? Chances are 3 opponents are going to have hit this board in some way and are going to continue a fair chunk of the time. At least one of them will continue. So this is a pretty wet connected board. I don't think I'm going to generate very many folds, and because of that, I'm just going to usually say quit, check it, and just be done with it. Now let's take a different situation where instead of that 7 of spades, we put a 3 of diamonds up there. So in that situation, we see that we have a value hand. All of a sudden, I'm definitely in a mode where I want to get stacks brewing, and I go forward from there. So you see, if I have value, I'm in that bet, get the pot going mode. If I have air or a bluff, usually I'm just asking myself, will I generate enough folds? Chances are I probably won't, especially when I don't have any equity to really back it up with. So there's nothing wrong with just checking, getting out of this, and just being totally done with it. So again, as a default, being very tight on the bluff side of the spectrum, really only bluffing if I think it's going to be an absolutely perfect situation. Otherwise, just be a little tighter, don't get involved, and, again, wait for a better situation to make a move or hope that next time you smash the heck out of the board instead. Okay, let's take a situation like this, where there's two limps to us, we're deciding what we want to do. We decide for whatever reason that this would be a better situation to limp behind as opposed to go for the double ISO, and thus we do that. So we end up going multi-way to it, end up catching a two-way straight draw with an overcard, and decide to go for a bet. And again, this would kind of be my default with a decent two-way straight draw or better type draw in a multi-way pot, usually going to be leading those out myself. So again, if you think about it just from a pure bluff standpoint, it makes sense. I do get folds from some better hands, some ace high here and there, things like pocket eights, pocket deuces, pocket sixes, so I'm definitely okay with the bet, and especially because there's only one person between myself and the button, decent chance that I'll be able to play this pot in position a fair chunk of the time going into the turn and riv, and I'll just make decisions from there. But unfortunately the button does call, as does the hijack, and we go multi-way to the turn, which we brick, and hijack decides to check. So at this point, I again classify my hand strength. I definitely still have a semi-bluff, and I just ask myself, okay, if I bet here, do I think I can generate enough folds? Well, two people called my flop bet, which means at least one of them probably has a queen a fair chunk. Do I think that a queen is going to fold now, or check call now and then check fold later? Probably not a tremendous amount of the time, just because, again, it's a limped pot. People do silly things in limped pots. So as a default, I'm probably just going to say forget it and check here, just kind of be done with it. If I end up getting a good price, like I do in this situation where I get 3.7 to 1, then I'll just call it and kind of play poker from there. But definitely make sure that you are looking at the price and not just calling because, LOL, I have a two-way straight draw. It needs to be more than that. It needs to be I'm getting a proper price. I think there's enough in applied odds to justify it. If I'm not getting a proper outright price, that sort of stuff. So in this particular situation, I should definitely have some implied odds. Also, my king can be good here and there, which can give me a pinch of an equity boost. So I'm definitely okay with this check call here. And then on the riv, we brick, and again, at this point, all we have is a pure bluff with king high, so I just ask myself, can I generate enough folds? Without information, probably not, and even if I did want to generate folds, I'd probably have to do something little unorthodox, probably go for like a $57 bet, and I just don't see any real reason to go for an overbet bluff without some massive information. So as a default, I'd probably just say forget it and just check and be done with it, and just let the other two goofballs do what they're going to do. So pretty easy situation. Again, just playing our hand out as best as possible. The big inflection point, in my opinion, is the turn as far as what you want to do. If you thought again that turn bluff could generate enough folds, okay, but I probably don't expect hijack to fold very often, given that he limp called that flop, which means he should be relatively strong and or relatively fishy and won't fold. So as a default, I'm probably not going to be doing a tremendous amount of bluffing here. Just play more straightforward like we did, and if we get a price like we did, simply call it, try to bink the riv. If we don't, pretty easy situation just to check fold, get out, and be done with it altogether. And I wanted to look at one more hand, and let's take a situation like this where there is a limp and another limp, and we're deciding what we want to do. And again, as I said, for my small blind completion range, I'm probably going to be completing here with things like suited aces and any two Broadway cards that I don't feel comfortable raising and I don't feel comfortable folding. So in this particular spot, ace-10 suited kind of fits a whole bunch of that, so I'm definitely going to be completing here and playing out. I don't really think you can go for a raise here without some really sick info, so I would just kind of complete and play poker from there. So I end up catching top pair, and as a default, when I catch top pair in like a 3 or 4-way pot, I'm probably just going to be stabbing it strictly for value. Again, I can get looked up by some second best stuff, things like draws, flushes, straight draws, maybe some 7x, maybe some worse ace like an ace-5 suited or something. So there's a bunch of different stuff that I can bet and get value from. I don't really want to check and risk it getting checked behind and then just give free equity to everyone and their mother. So I'm generally more apt just to go for the free play stab. The complete stab, which is definitely something that a lot of people don't do. and a lot of people would actually make a lot more value by knowing and learning when to implement this stab. And again, it's strictly for value. It's not saying that you're never going to be behind here. It's just saying that this bet is really strictly a value bet. So we do end up getting called by the hijack, go heads up to the turn, and I am going to say this real quick. A lot of people tend to get confused because the deuce in the turn is a club. If the deuce on the turn were a deuce of diamonds, for some odd reason people think it's like a totally different card. That just because we picked up a backdoor flush draw, all of a sudden our hand has changed into this miraculously different hand strength, which is really not true at all. We still have a hand that's somewhere between a value and showdown value hand. That simple. And obviously which one it is really dependent on who MP2 is, So if MP2 is the kind of guy that's going to make a massive amount of calling mistakes, he's some sort of passive fish, he's the kind of guy who has a lot of draw stuff in his range and he would prefer to call it, and if you check to him, he would probably just check it behind, then obviously this is a very easy situation just to go for a bet strictly for value. So it's really dependent on who he is, and just like if MP2 were the kind of guy that would just never make a calling mistake, or he's definitely the kind of guy that would make a lot of betting mistakes, he'd bluff a ton of his range if you check to him, well maybe you go for a check there, induce a bet from him, and kind of go for a check call turn, check feel riv. So don't just bet because I picked up a backdoor flush draw, because that's not what it is. You're betting because you think you're getting looked up by second best, or you're checking because you don't think the bet accomplishes anything and you think the check would be more plus EV. It's that level of simple. Don't get confused just because it's the deuce of clubs. So in this situation, we do think we can go for Val, so we do. He calls, and we end up bricking the riv, and in this situation, we're deciding what we want to do. So again, I have something between value and showdown value. If I thought that he had enough second best stuff, that would still make calls, so if he would call the riv with 7x still, or 6x still, then maybe I go for, or a worse ace. But a lot of the times he's going to have things like whiff draws in his range, or he's not going to call a bet with, say, something like 7x or 6x, being that there are more overcards on the board to that now. So in that particular situation, or if you think that he will just bluff off a tremendous amount of his range, then I might go for a check with intentions of snapping off a bet and just go from there. So again, the big things to take away from this are the small blind completion range, also the way that we want to play that flop as far as the stab is concerned, and then also the way we want to visualize the turn. Is the deuce of clubs this miraculous card, or is it just simply a deuce that happened to give us some extra equity on the back door, but did we really need that equity if we already had the best hand the whole way through? So again, just some various things you want to be thinking about in these situations that can definitely make your limped pot play a bit more profitable. So that's going to wrap it up for this video. Again, we talked all about limped pots and the strategies we want to implement both pre-flop and post-flop, as far as what ranges we want to limp pre-flop and whether or not we should just fold it or if we should simply go for a raise instead. And again, as a default, from late position, I tend to be way more limpy, especially if there's a limp or two in front of us, strictly because there's situations where I can take position post-flop. I have hands that can do very, very well in a deep SPR pop, but aren't quite good enough to go for a raise, especially with multiple limpers. So definitely make sure you're looking for situations where you can limp behind more. But as a default, again, if you don't feel comfortable post-flop, there's really no reason for you to start adding a tremendous amount of hands into your limp range, because all you're doing is adding extra spots where there's going to be a lot of question marks. You're sometimes going to show up with these janky top pairs or these janky second pairs. You're not quite sure how you should visualize them. So definitely don't get in a mindset where you're just limping behind a tremendous amount of the time. If it's a good spot, whatever. But as a default, just there's nothing wrong with being a little bit tighter, staying out of trouble, and not just limping for the sake of limping. And again, being careful about your range. Don't be limping things like Queen 7 suited just because it's suited and it has a queen in it. Like, that's not a good reason. Needs usually I'll limp in things like strong suited connectors, but that's because I know the hand has a lot of equity. I know how it's going to play. I know that I can catch top pairs that are going to have more value as opposed to catching top pair with a meh kicker, which is not quite as valuable, to say the least. And again, also thinking about your small blind completion range. From the big blind, you don't have the option. You kind of just have to check it and see a flop with it, and it sucks when you catch one of those difficult spots with it. But if you think about the flop stab, if you also think about just classifying your hand strength quickly, and again, getting out of it if it's a bad situation, And again, as a default, just play tighter. There's really nothing wrong with that. If you catch a janky hand from your free play from the big blind, don't be the guy that's just sitting there giving a tremendous amount of action. If it's a bad situation, simply get out of it. It's not very difficult. So hopefully that kind of gets you thinking about limped pots a little bit better. Again, the pre-flop stuff and also the post-flop stuff as far as classifying your hand strength, thinking about where your edge is really coming from in this spot. The confusing one could possibly be the flop stat with things like two-way straight draws are better. But as a default, especially when there's less limpers, I'm definitely going to be fighting for those pots. Because if I pick the pot up uncontested, that's totally awesome. And if I happen to get a caller or two, well, at least I have a sick chunk of equity that I can try to actualize. And because most of my draws like that are going to be caught either directly from the small blind, but most likely from button or cutoff where I'm going to be in position, it can make life very, very easy. So again, hopefully this gets you thinking, hopefully this gets you seeing these situations more clearly, both pre and post, and same as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask down below. Otherwise, good luck out there, happy grinding, and best of luck in your limped pots.